Readers, will you think for a minute about an argument you've overheard? It could be an argument you heard on the bus or the basketball court or at the kitchen table. Describe what that argument was. If you remember any key lines from the argument, be sure to include those. When arguments include language like, this is an amazing idea, or this is an awful idea, they're pretty easy to spot. You can hear them coming because they announce themselves. Here's the challenge. In the books you're reading now, the arguments tend to be more subtle. Authors won't always come right out and say, racial discrimination was 100% wrong. Instead, they're more likely to say most Black women worked in the service economy. It's up to you to recognize the argument and figure out the sides. Figure out the arguments the author outlines is just as important as figuring out the central ideas or themes because the arguments often help you understand the perspectives of different groups. Let me give you some tips to help you do this. Today, I want to teach you that arguments in literary nonfiction books are more subtle. So you have to read extra closely to notice them. Sometimes the author will include opposing or conflicting perspectives or strong opinion words. Those techniques often signal that there's an argument worth studying. Let's give this a try. I thought we could revisit the section Trouble in the Lunchroom that we read yesterday. Instead of tracking the characters or paying attention to what the text is teaching, let's read closely to notice if there's a subtle argument tucked into this section. Notice whether the author mentions opposing perspectives or includes opinion words, because those techniques often give you a clue that the author is hinting at an argument. Trouble in the Lunchroom. In the middle of the day, the women of West Computing walked as a group over to the cafeteria. Langley was so crowded that each team had a designated 30-minute window for lunch, just enough time for a quick meal and a little conversation. Most groups sat together out of habit. For Dorothy and the West Computers, segregated seating was required. The women of West Computing were the only Black women professionals at the laboratory, not exactly excluded, but not quite included either. A white cardboard sign on a table in the back of the cafeteria said Colored Computers in crisply stenciled black letters. It was the only sign in the cafeteria. No other group needed assigned seating. This kind of racial insult was all too common. It was a kind of subtle jab that African Americans had learned to tolerate, if not accept, in order to function in their daily lives. The women probably expected it, but in the environment of the laboratory, a place that had chosen them for their intellectual talents, the sign seemed particularly offensive. Pause for a few minutes to determine if there's an argument tucked into this section, and if so, what the author is arguing. Does the author emphasize how groups have different perspectives about the same event? Does the author hint at her position? Pause the video so you can take a few notes and jot your ideas. You may have noted that there is clearly an argument here because whoever is leaving the sign believes the cafeteria should be segregated, and the West Computers do not. Did you notice that the author mentions the West Computers' perspective on the sign, that it seemed particularly offensive? We even got a hint at the author's position, that this kind of racial insult was all too common. It seems like Margot Lee Shetterly is arguing that segregation itself was an insult. Often in nonfiction, the author will write about different perspectives or positions, even if he or she is clearly on one side. Margot Lee Shetterly doesn't say there definitely shouldn't be segregation seating in the cafeteria, and the people who are leaving the sign were wrong. Instead, she's saying there was segregated seating in the cafeteria, and we have to infer the argument from the way she writes about it. Once you identify an argument hiding in a text, it's interesting to trace the different positions and the reasoning that supports those positions. This can be especially challenging because with history, there's usually a side that won, a side we often think of now as the right side. It can be tricky to think about other, less admirable sides of the issue and to try to make sense of their reasoning. I want you to take some time to work to determine what the different sides of the issue are. Once you know people's positions, try to make sense of their reasoning. Why are they taking these positions? What do they believe that is pushing them to support these positions? You could start by naming out the different sides of the argument. Readers, let's think about some of these positions. Miriam took the position that the best way to handle the discrimination in the lunchroom was to fight it. And the other West computers and Miriam's own husband seemed to think that maybe that wasn't a great idea, or at least they weren't going to do it themselves. In the case of Miriam, her reasoning seems to be that you have to stand up for yourself no matter what. She doesn't say that, but when she says they're just going to have to, meaning fire her, it's clear she's willing to face any consequence. But her husband, and maybe some other West computers, seem to think it's too risky to take on that kind of fight, that it might be better just to ignore the insults. So even though they all think what's happening is wrong, they disagree on how to handle it because their beliefs and therefore their reasoning are different. The author didn't really include reasoning to support the position that the sign should be in the cafeteria. There wasn't any argument for why the segregation and discrimination should have been allowed. This is another way that an author shows what side of an argument he or she prefers or thinks is stronger. Readers, in addition to noticing the central ideas, themes, and issues that authors outline in your books, will you also be on the lookout for arguments? Remember that the arguments in information books are often subtle, so you'll need to read closely to discover them, and then to track the various positions and how they're supported. You'll also want to notice where the author stands. Are there any arguments you already think might be hiding in your text so far? There may be other work you're planning on tackling today. Make sure you use the anchor chart to make a plan, and then head off to read.